within a bleak and dismal swamp, hidden beneath its murky waters, lies the headquarters of the most sinister villains of all time. The Legion of Doom.
Whether they're calling themselves the Justice League or the Super Friends or whatever, the classic DC heroes typically have parallel villains, their arch foes, that pop up again and again in media and in the comic books. You look at Superman, there's a guy who's defined by his incredible power, yet also his willingness to allow the status quo to stand. He's someone who protects the Earth and allows the Earth to define itself, despite the fact that he could literally push the Earth out of orbit into the sun in certain incarnations. His arch rival is Lex Luthor, who is a normal human being. He has no powers whatsoever. He's just brilliant, and he's willing to use that brilliance to its utmost degree, to the point where his inventions and his plans would allow him to take over the world if not for the invention of Superman. Then you have Batman, a fellow who's trained himself to human perfection. He has extraordinary gadgets. He's probably the world's most brilliant detective, and his enemy, as far as anybody can tell, has never had any sort of training. He's just a scrawny geek called the Joker, who is so mad that he cannot be predicted. He kills when he wants to, saves when he wants to. His plots don't make any sense, and yet somehow miraculously are effective. So he's an excellent counter to the Batman. Then you look at Hal Jordan, the greatest of all the Green Lanterns, supposedly. He's a member of a intergalactic corps governed over by the Guardians of the Universe, and this corps acts as policemen or knights on all the worlds in existence. But the Green Lantern that preceded Hal Jordan as the greatest of the corps, Sinestro, took the power given to him by the Guardians of the Universe and used it to become a fascist to try to conquer worlds. Order was so important to him that he was willing to enforce it under a boot heel. And when he was denied Green Lantern power, he went to the enemies of the Guardians, the Weaponers or Quard, who created a unique individual ring just for him, which not only projected a form of energy that the Green Lantern Corps couldn't directly counter because of a necessary impurity in their rings, but also his ring could absorb their power to power himself. But as originally conceived, there was only one Sinestro ring against this entire Corps. So there's this excellent balance of similarities and contrasts between Sinestro and the Green Lanterns. The Flash is generally regarded to have one of the best rogues gallery in all of comics, and what's interesting about that is ultimately the Flash has one power. He does things really, really fast. What makes the Flash an interesting character is that he figures out all sorts of interesting applications for that one power, so that it seems like he has a broad spectrum of abilities. Now, he does have foes that are his evil opposites, that have essentially the exact same power as him, and that he just manages to outsmart. But what I think is interesting about the Flash rogues is that almost all of the major ones are similar to Flash in that they have that one gimmick. Captain Cold freezes things. Heatwave burns things. Boomerang throws boomerangs. An unimaginative creator might see that as being a hindrance, but typically what makes those Flash rogues so great is that they find so many cool ways of demonstrating their powers, so many interesting applications, that just like the Flash, where it could be one-trick ponies, ends up being a smorgasbord. So the fact that you have strong, recognizable heroes and sinister, menacing, formidable villains makes it easy to see why DC has had a tendency to push four white male heroes on so much of their merchandising in recent years: Superman, Batman, Flash, and Green Lantern. But whether you're a fan of the Super Friends model or the Justice League model, if you're a DC fan, you always get the sense of some of your favorites being left out by a quartet, where you're expecting at least a 5-piece, a 7-piece, or more team. And in particular, if you're a knee-jerk liberal like me, you're wondering, where's the girl at? Wonder Woman is one of the most powerful, most capable, and most recognizable heroines in all of comics, if not the most. So why can't she break into this boys club? And one explanation allows us to go back to Challenge of the Super Friends to look at that original Legion of Doom. There were two villains that were meant to represent Wonder Woman's rogues. Giganta, who from the start was not only clearly the B-lister that lucked into the Legion of Doom, but also often got pitted against Apache Chief, who could similarly grow to the size of a skyscraper, and the two of them could do battle with each other with much greater ease than a tiny normal-sized woman fighting a giant woman. Plus, if you've got a giant Native American running around, you really need to have somebody for him to punch. So Wonder Woman's main foe was the Cheetah. And Cheetah compares well with another Legion of Doom member that looks kind of cool, but ultimately I think hurts the hero that he's paired against, Black Manta. In the case of both Black Manta and the Cheetah, you basically have non-powered characters. Cheetah was fast, she was agile, she had claws. Black Manta had a scuba suit that shot laser beams out of the helmet, and they're going up against heroes who have an enormous wealth of powers. Aquaman is superhumanly strong, he's superhumanly fast, he can go underwater without any kind of aid. He has sea forces, he has a team of heroes that work with him that have other powers. In the cartoons, Aquaman could form those balls of water and fire them at you like cannonballs. He could talk to the sea life. Wonder Woman in the classic incarnation has a flying invisible jet. She has a lasso that's unbreakable and compels people to her will or to at least tell the truth. She's incredibly fast. She's incredibly strong. She can coast on air currents. She has an entire island of immortal Amazons with super science as backup. And she fights a lady in a cat suit with claws. And I'm not trying to diminish the Cheetah. She's actually an interesting character in the history of comics because while there have often been women in cat suits in comics, for DC, she was kind of the first. Catwoman, back when she was introduced, was running around in a long, slinky dress. I don't think she started using the cat of nine tails until the late 40s, and she didn't start running around in the familiar cat suit until the 60s. Cheetah arrived fairly early in Wonder Woman's run in the early 40s. She did have many of the classic accoutrements of Catwoman. If you look at her appearances in Challenge of the Super Friends, she really does seem like a quasi-Catwoman. But in truth, she was a fairly minor character in the Wonder Woman canon up through the 70s. She had appeared less than 10 times in Wonder Woman comics. A couple of times in the 40s, a few times in the 60s, a few more times in the 70s. And then she was replaced in the early 80s by a new incarnation. That only lasted for a few appearances. And then yet another new incarnation turned up in the late 80s. Created by George Perez, Barbara Minerva is the most famous of the cheetahs. She is what I would call a whiff cheetah, which is the female version of a weird cheetah, which basically means she's a lady. She's a shapeshifter or a changeling that turns from a woman into a anthropomorphized cat woman. And as reconceived by George Perez, she has heightened strength, extraordinary speed, and extremely durable claws that are able to cut Wonder Woman. Like most people, my introduction to the cheetah was through the Super Friends cartoon show. I don't think I ever read her in a comic book. I think maybe I'd seen her in house ads. So my true introduction to the comic book cheetah was in the debut of the Barbara Minerva incarnation in Wonder Woman number 9, which came out around 1987-88. And in that first appearance, Cheetah was pretty awesome. She was super lethal. She was a total badass. And she could have been unique if she'd come out about 15 years earlier. But one of the problems is starting in the late 70s and running through to about the early 90s, it seemed like whiff creatures were required by every superhero and supervillain team. I believe it all started with Tigra, who was a popular member of the Avengers. And before you knew it, you had Wolfsbane in the New Mutants. You had Lady Hepzibah in the Starjammers, Feral and Thorn in X-Force, Panther in the New Titans. Half of the Thundercats are whiff cats. These whiff creatures became a trope in comics. They are so common, but Cheetah could have been like one of the great avatars of that. She could have been this great powerhouse that was the opposite number of Wonder Woman. And she might well have been, because I haven't read very many of the Cheetah appearances that Perez, her reimagining creator, wrote for the character. Instead, I know the Barbara Minerva Cheetah mostly from William Messner Loebs' run onward. And beginning with Messner Loebs, Cheetah was just extremely lackluster. In Messner Loebs' very first Wonder Woman story, Cheetah is captured and has to be rescued by Wonder Woman. She popped up another times after that, but usually she's working with other villains because she's already proven that she can't take Wonder Woman on her own. When John Byrne took over the Wonder Woman series, he had Cheetah participate in Underworld Unleashed, an event where a demonic entity called Neuron was supposed to significantly enhance the powers of underwhelming villains. So the first problem with that is that if the Cheetah is supposed to be the most visible, most recognizable villainess to battle Wonder Woman, why would she need the Neuron treatment in the first place? Secondly, I can't really tell you what Neuron did. He made Cheetah more feral. She was more savage. I think perhaps she was stronger and maybe a little faster, but she really wasn't that much different. And because she was so feral, she was kind of dumb now. So she went from at least being an intelligent villainess who wasn't capable of taking on someone as powerful as Wonder Woman to someone that really had no business being in a Wonder Woman comic because she was so underwhelming. And they did various things to try to build her back up again. Greg Rucka and Jeff Johns did a crossover between Flash and Wonder Woman where the Cheetah was romancing Professor Zoom and being taught how to further access the Speed Force so that she could be a more capable villainess. But that never really amounted to much. Plus, it's a situation where the male character is coming in to make the female character better. That's problematic for a Wonder Woman comic. They tried to introduce a new Cheetah during Phil Jimenez's run that was male. They tried to introduce another female Cheetah during the J. Michael Straczynski / Phil Hester run. That didn't catch on. My feeling is that the Barbara Minerva Cheetah had her time, that the identity has established that it's a legacy role, that you had the original Cheetah, Priscilla Rich, followed by Debbie Domain, Barbara Minerva, and now we should probably have had a new Cheetah by now. They tried to build up this Minerva Cheetah during that big villains month in the New 52 continuity. But at the end of the day, the Cheetah is still the cat lady that fights Wonder Woman. There isn't any strong ideological bent to Cheetah. She's just a villainess. She steals, she kills. Why does she get into fights with Wonder Woman? Because she's an evil archaeologist and she's off and trying to get ancient items of power that Wonder Woman and her struggle over. It's not bad for a second or third tier villain, but for someone who's seen as one of the major Wonder Woman foes, it's just not enough. So this brings us to Wonder Woman 77 special number 2, the longest and lead story being The Cat Came Back by Mark Andreyko, Drew Johnson, and Richard Ortiz. In this story, Barbara Minerva is still an archaeologist who has an exhibit of her dig items that is being pushed out of the museum in favor of a Wonder Woman exhibit. The director of the museum explains that, look, we got to get people to come to the museum in the first place. Your pots aren't going to compete with Wonder Woman's girdle, invisible plane, so on and so forth. Barbara Minerva is deeply resentful of having to pull an all-nighter to essentially single-handedly pack up her exhibit and get out of Wonder Woman's way. And at one point, she comes across a ceremonial dagger that she accidentally cuts herself with and apparently infects herself with the power of a whiff cheetah. Meanwhile, Wonder Woman had already made herself handy by stopping a attempted art robbery, and then she was on hand to inaugurate her exhibit. True to the 1970s setting of these stories, in attendance are Teddy Kennedy and Henry Kissinger, both saying that Wonder Woman sounded like she would have been a great candidate for office. The new cheetah crashes the event, and she has a device that's not associated with the character. She's running around with a blowgun, firing darts at attendees. Wonder Woman and Cheetah have a nice little battle. The cheetah finally falls, but as it turns out, those darts contain more of the potion that turned her into the cheetah, and now there's a whole army of cheetah people coming after Wonder Woman. Diana escapes from the museum and ends up at the zoo, where the roused cheetah goes to the pens holding the big tigers, lions, so forth, lets them loose, and sends them out after Wonder Woman. As the cheetah gathers her cheetah people, Wonder Woman returns with the big cats. I'm right here, Cheetah, and your friends would like some words with you.
No, it isn't possible. I am the alpha. They are.
No longer under your evil thrall. You see, I have a way with animals too. They like me a lot. Diana's big cats end up holding the cheetah people at bay. Wonder Woman and the cheetah fight again, and given that Wonder Woman has already beaten Cheetah once in the story, it's a foregone conclusion that's going to happen again. I loathe the destruction of artifacts, but this is for the greater good. Wonder Woman gets a hold of the cheetah dagger and shatters it. Barbara Minerva returns to normal, so do the cheetah people, and Wonder Woman is last seen petting one of the big cats, while Minerva gets locked up in a padded cell, promising that the cheetah would return soon. One thing that was kind of nice about this story is that this version of Barbara Minerva is tied into previous incarnations. The Debbie Domain cheetah, one of her main attributes was that she was supposed to be, I believe, the niece of the original cheetah, Priscilla Rich. In this story, Barbara Minerva takes on that role, and Minerva had always taken visual cues from the Debbie Domain version of the cheetah. But since they make a point of acknowledging that the Golden Age cheetah did exist, that Wonder Woman did fight her in her 1940s adventures, one of the major differences between the Wonder Woman TV show and comic books is on the show, Wonder Woman was actually supposed to be centuries old. And so there was no problem with the same Wonder Woman having been active during World War II as was active in the 1970s, once the show actually went from being a period show to a contemporaneous one. So it was nice that by tying in this cheetah with a previous one, which I don't believe was ever seen on the television show, it gives the comic an opportunity to acknowledge that there was a 1940s incarnation of the 70s show as well. But one other callback that I think was really valuable is that Barbara Minerva, from the onset of this story, is shown to be violently envious and aggrieved with Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman has taken her legitimate accomplishments as an archaeologist and shoving them aside for a big promotion for the museum because everybody's interested in Wonder Woman and nobody's really interested in Barbara Minerva's pots. But Minerva is still somewhat sympathetic because she didn't actively seek to become the cheetah and go after Wonder Woman, and she's motivated by this great envy. All this is a callback to the original cheetah, Priscilla Rich, who suffered from multiple personality disorder, and if you've seen the original Spider-Man movie, had a very similar dynamic as Norman Osborn with Green Goblin. Basically, Priscilla Rich would look in a mirror and she would see the cheetah, who was this manifestation of all of her jealousies and all of her hatred of other women, and she became this alter ego. She manifested this delusion that she had when she looked at herself in the mirror. And in doing so, that cheetah had meaning. She had an ideological bent that allowed her to contrast against Wonder Woman. And it's something that has always been missing from the Barbara Minerva version of the character, and I think will always diminish the potential of the cheetah because until she stops being a cat woman and becomes a mirror to Wonder Woman, becomes a contrast, becomes a conflict in her essence rather than just by the devising of a scripter, she will never be truly worthy of the annals of DC villain history. The cheetah will continue to be the person who shows up because they need a girl supervillain. The one thing about the Wonder Woman 77 special number 2 is that I wasn't aware that this was going to happen. There was a gap in production from the first special, which was initially released as a series of weekly digital installments and then a printed version of same, and then they restarted it again with the same writer and mostly the same artists. And it feels like maybe they made a conscious effort to make some changes from the original special. But one thing that's really noticeable between the two is that both Drew Johnson and Richard Ortiz contributed to the original special, and in that one there was a much greater sense of visual continuity. The stories that were taken over from one artist to another still looked similar enough enough to where you didn't really notice that there was a change in art unless you were looking for it. Whereas in this one, it's very pointed. It's very obvious. Drew Johnson stops at one point. Rich Ortiz starts at another. I like both artists. They both do a good job with the story, but they're very different. And you're aware that partway through this one story, things have changed up on the creative end. That tale is followed up by Celsia 451. This one drawn by the person that's usually a painter, Kat Staggs, perhaps best known for doing the covers to the Smallville Season 11 comic books. I'm going to assume she works in a digital medium. Her art has that sort of look that reminds me of guys like Miguel Sepulveda. Once again, the story is grounded in the 1970s by rotating heavily around fears of 3 Mile Island, nuclear power. Basically, there's a meltdown that turns an American town into a Chernobyl type situation. One character survives that meltdown, and she becomes an agent of vengeance with combination cold and heat powers, which she uses to attack and kill businessmen and politicians that she holds accountable for the meltdown. A third party is brought in the form of the Atomic Knights, a group of power-armored agents sent to stop Celsia, and they look like a nice hybrid of the original 50s, 60s Murphy Anderson Knights and the more modern 80s versions that were more like Iron Man, I suppose. At the end of the day, Wonder Woman manages to convince Celsia to stop her reign of terror and try to pursue a more peaceful legal means of shutting down the people that she holds responsible for the nightmare situation that killed her family and most of the people in her town. And one of the knights actually helps to make that happen by recording an incriminating conversation that otherwise would have been lost. It's a nice looking story, and I do like that it recalls the 70s. It's also nice to see a relatively new character introduced. I'm not familiar with there ever being a Celsia previously in Wonder Woman stories. At first I thought she might end up being the Blue Snowman, in fact, but it feels a little long. It feels a bit labored. The art is nice sometimes and stiff other times, which is an issue you tend to have with painters. They try so hard to be realistic that sometimes they lose their vitality. And one of the things that's most pointed is you clearly have the Lyle Wagner version of Steve Trevor roaming around, who's part of the same spy agency as Diana Prince. But the thing is, Diana Prince herself never appears in any of these three stories. And since the Diana Prince character was such an important part of the 70s Wonder Woman television show, it's weird to me to have an entire extra-length special in which Diana never appears, only Wonder Woman. And mostly it's Wonder Woman in adventures that are much more superheroic, especially with a character like Celsia that has a very visually dynamic power. That's something that the 70s television show could have never afforded, and it's fine to take advantage of the comic book medium to manifest that character, but it undermines the conceit that this is supposed to be a continuation of the television show that's supposed to be working within that show's aesthetic. And to me, more importantly, is by focusing so much on Wonder Woman and not having any time left over for Diana Prince, especially since her relationship with Steve Trevor was much more important to the TV show than Steve's relationship with Wonder Woman. It makes this comic feel much more like the 80s run. It makes it feel much more like what Perez did when he erased the Diana Prince character, when he abandoned Steve Trevor as a supporting character and romantic interest. So for me, I'm reading this and it feels like more of the same type of comics that Wonder Woman appeared in for 20 to 30 years straight, because there was no Diana Prince. And hey, this podcast is called Diana Prince. Kind of have a bit of an interest in that particular character. Anyway, the final story was called Wisdom of Solomon. This one featured art by Jason Badauer. And again, this is a curious bit of art because if I recall correctly, Badauer was the one that got everybody's attention in the first special by having the hyper-realistic renditions of the Linda Carter Wonder Woman and the Lyle Wagner Steve Trevor, where they looked like they were ripped right off the show. This story is odd because there are some Greg Landy qualities where I'm not sure if there's a filter used. I don't know if it's something that's much more directly taken from photographs. But whereas in that first story, there's a lot of nice cross-hatching, a lot of stuff that made it look, more artistic, more of a translation of something that exists in reality to something that's on the drawn page. In this story, it feels much more like some sort of a computer thing. There's a lot of creepy eyes and super realistic heads floating on not so realistic bodies. Badauer's default art style recalls Matt Haley, who contributed to the original Wonder Woman 77 special. And I like those parts. Those parts look nice. But then when you juxtapose that with the weird photorealistic images, it creates a cognitive dissonance. It doesn't feel like this artist drew the same thing, that it's the same artist drawing one page versus the other page. And especially in the case of Lyle Wagner, he's pops up and he's wearing a costume and it looks sort of like a photo head floating on an animated body. It just doesn't look right. It is somewhat used for comedic effect. There's one moment in particular that I really like where Wonder Woman wins a carnival prize for Steve. It's a nice little role reversal there. And then this odd approach to the artwork enhances the comedic quality. But then it goes from that to what's essentially a horror story as Solomon Grundy comes up from the swamps and this giant undead zombie is defending a descendant of his from an abusive husband. And once the descendant decides that she's going to stand up to her husband and not take his abuse anymore, Solomon Grundy goes away and Wonder Woman's there to take care of her, which very much sets well with the themes of the Wonder Woman TV show. But it doesn't 100% make sense for the Solomon Grundy character. He seems to be dispatched relatively easily for what's usually a relentless powerhouse. And the heavier themes themes of the story don't contrast well against the weird photo referencing glitches. So at the end of this special, I'm a little bit less enthused with the Wonder Woman 77 project. I don't necessarily like the ways in which they've gotten away from the stated intention of the project to essentially revive that Wonder Woman television show in print form, but I'm also conflicted because I like the way Andreyko plays with elements of the comic books being mingled with elements of the TV show. I just wish that there was a little bit more of the feel of the TV show in these stories, and I definitely want a lot more Diana Prince. We received retweets and favorites from Edgar Allenby, Emily Rockland, Martin Gray, and Trekker Talk, and just a favorite from Count Druncula. Ed Moore wrote, "Wow, first Martian Manhunter, now Adam, and Wonder Woman. Excellent group of shows. Thanks." Michael Bailey wrote, "Really enjoyed the first episode of your Wonder Woman show. Agreed with many of your points." Martin Gray wrote, "Suffering Sappho. When's the next Diana Prince Wonder Woman podcast then?" Luke Daub wrote, "I listened to your Wonder Woman podcast today. Loved it. Can't wait to hear more." Received a comment from Yip saying, "Excellent podcast. I look forward to future episodes. For me, Perez's run is nothing short of amazing. I felt myself develop a strong attachment to Wonder Woman when reading this title, like nothing I've ever felt for a fictional character before." Siskoid wrote, "If we're talking about our experiences with Wonder Woman, I think mine often mirror yours. I have a lot of love for the character, but agree there aren't that many runs of her stories I actually like. Met her in Super Friends, probably. Watched the first World War II season of the TV show relatively recently, and while the plots are mostly crime of the week stuff, Linda Carter was just perfect. Love the song, and it's one of my great joys that it plays when Wonder Woman flies in the Lego Batman 3 game I'm playing now. In the comics, I appreciate her in Justice League of America, but her series wasn't great when I started reading comics, the Don Heck era. Have maybe one issue, which I like only for the Huntress backup. Didn't get into the Perez version, though I tried. Nice art, but a little dull for me. I don't think I really read any Wonder Woman comics until Gail Simone, which is the run I loved, even if she went very weird sometimes. The Joseph Michael Straczynski revision was just awful. Not as awful as his Superman, but still. And I just finished the New 52 Azzarello series, which I liked, but lasted too long and meandered quite a lot. It was more about a new horror take on Greek mythology than Diana herself. Read the first Finch issue because I wanted to see how bad it would be, and it exceeded my expectations. It's Ed Wood terrible. My favorite Wonder Woman? The Justice League version. So I'm all for her dating Batman, it seems. But I'm as incensed by the lazy Superman relationship that hurts both the characters. They did a good job with the direct-to-DVD animated movie as well. But DC properties always seem to be done right on TV as opposed to their actual medium. As for Wonder Woman 77, I would have hoped to see it last longer. Great likenesses and some fun disco stylings. I guess I would have liked to see it last to see more Wonder Woman villains in the 70s style. And hey, any Wonder Woman comic that isn't that Finch book or team up with Superman is automatically superior. And wrote, "Figure I'll add my experience, which seems to echo both of yours. Long post. Wonder Woman is a character I want to love. You can tell by looking at my collection and seeing smatterings of runs I own. I sample, hoping I'll see something worth reading, and then end up tapering off. So I tried some of the Heck stuff, I tried some of the Roy Thomas, Gene Colan stuff, I tried the early Perez stuff, but even that didn't hold me. I sampled the Jimenez stuff and got some of the crossover issues. Byrne stuff wasn't good. I tried the Heinberg stuff and left, came back to try Picoult and left. And obviously I'm not reading the Finch stuff. As you can see, I have come to the property over and over hoping for a winner. I have a large chunk of the Messner-Loeb run, spanning from just before the Deodato era right up to the end. I thought Deodato's art, while bootylicious, was pretty dynamic. I thought Artemis was a decent foil for Diana, being a proactive hero. And I true was lured in by the "this is big" promotions. I actually don't mind that run and still think the art, when not too provocative, is solid. I have a large chunk of the Rucker run and probably would say that this is my favorite Diana. And I thought that the modernization of the Greek gods, Athena with a laptop, Ares being the god of conflict, was pretty interesting. Add the Gorgon fight and Diana blinding herself, and I think this is a win. While I didn't get as much out of the Simone run as I hoped, I still thought it was good enough to read entirely. In particular, I love the Ends of the Earth storyline, which teamed her with Beowulf, Stalker, and Claw. Heck, Frank, I love that run so much it spurred me into reviewing some of those issues over on Bloodlines. And lastly, I did get the Azzarello Chang run. It has deep flaws. I don't like the raping, killing Amazons. I really don't like Diana being another daughter of Zeus. It pigeonholes her, makes her more ordinary. But the politics of Olympus, the interpretation of the gods, Diana's defense for friends, and this version of Orion made it a tight read. On the landscape of the New 52, this was at least solid storytelling, even if it wasn't the Diana I would want in the DCU. In the end, I read the entire run like it was simply a prolonged Elseworlds. One last thing worth mentioning. DC at least had the good sense back in the day to put excellent cover artists on the book. Bolland, Hughes, J.G. Jones. I mean, some of those covers are so killer I bought the issue only for that image. Look forward to this podcast. Count Druncula wrote, "I only heard about this new show because Ange mentioned it on Twitter, but I'm thrilled you finally got around to podcasting about our beloved Diana. Wonder Woman is one of my 3 favorite DC heroes, but just like you, Frank, and you, Ange, and you, Siskoid, my affection for the character is based primarily on the idea more than the content of the stories. As you described with Primordial Heroes, Wonder Woman has always been there since as long as I was a conscious observer of popular culture. I really enjoyed the Greg Rucka run. I know it wasn't without its faults, but I thought it did have a good handle on the character. He made sure that Fierce Warrior was part of her repertoire, but not the soul-defining characteristic. And the part where Wonder Woman blinds herself during her fight with Medusa is one of my all-time favorite Wonder Woman moments. As much as I enjoyed Gail Simone's work, I agree that she was not a good fit in the book. However, I did absolutely love her first story arc on the book. The Circle is one of my favorite Wonder Woman stories. Unfortunately, things went south from there. I remember when the rumor first broke that J. Michael Straczynski was leaving Marvel for DC. While everyone assumed he'd be writing Superman, I said he'd be an awesome fit on Wonder Woman. Turns out he did both books, and they were both huge disappointments. Great first episode, Frank. Looking forward to hearing more. Martin Gray wrote, I really enjoyed that. Thanks, Frank. I began reading 1D via Passed On Silver Age issues. I think my first was number 125. Steve Trevor, Merman, and Abiba Man fighting for Diana's heart. Marvelous. At the same time, I was buying then new issues of Groovy Die Prince, with number 182 being my first. But it was the Jose Delbo drawn version who became my Diana, through the Gene Colan and Don Heck issues, which actually were a great read. Dan Mishkin did some great character work. I found Perez's Diana terribly wet. Thank God Loebs came along and gave her a sense of humor. Burns' run was bonkers. He annoyed me from the off with his lazy refusal to draw enough stars on her shorts, while Luke's Diana was far too mopey. Jimenez's Diana was a tad Perez earnest and saddled with snooty Trevor Barnes, but had some lovely art and a few genuinely great moments. Simonson's short arc was a fine read. He made Trevor Barnes likable before killing him. But as for Greg Rucka, talk about stretching things out. I remember one page that was just Diana crossing a hall, and I hated the Gorgon Eye business. Heinberg and Picoult were mistakes. Gail Simone was going great guns until Genocide showed up. JMS, kill me now. Thank God for Hester. As for Azzarello, I wonder how he'd write an actual Wonder Woman book. Mind, at least as an actual writer, the Finch issues are simply amateurish. Why didn't DC take the post-convergence opportunity to get someone with a singular vision on the book, and who likes the idea of Diana as an ambassador who fights for peace? Anyway, thanks again for a great show. So just to let you folks know, it's been the better part of half a year since the first episode, moving into the second. So you may be wondering where this show went and where it's going. The truth is there should have been another episode between now and then. I was going to do a convergence week that was going to come across several of my little podcasts. Unfortunately, there were some production issues, and I finally gave up on it for the time being at least. But the intention was always for this Diana Prince podcast to be something of a placeholder in the year 2015. 2016 will mark the 75th anniversary of the character, and for most of 2014 and 2015, I've been working on the Martian Manhunter 60th anniversary, but I knew at some point in 2016 I was going to transition away from heavy coverage of Martian Manhunter to Wonder Woman. She's been waiting for a long time. The world has been waiting for her. She's going to get her first motion picture appearance in the year 2016, and I would definitely want to look more into the comic books. I have hundreds and hundreds of Wonder Woman comic books that I've not had an opportunity to discuss on blogs. I really want to do that on podcasts, so I'm looking forward to that. But this will continue to be every few months or maybe seasonal podcasts until later in 2016, when you're going to see a lot more episodes start to roll out. Also, not to rain on anybody's parade, but if you've ever seen Saint Seiya, also known as Knights of the Zodiac, depending on what nation you catch this particular bit of anime, that whole sequence where Wonder Woman blinds herself is swiped from that show. So that plays into my dislike of Rucka for being heavily derivative. It's a shame that somebody's favorite Wonder Woman moments was borrowed from somebody else. Wonder Woman is the copyright of DC Comics Entertainment. This is a non-profit fan-produced podcast. No infringement of any copyrights are intended, and where copyrighted material appears, it is believed protected under fair use. If you enjoy the show, please feel free to leave a comment on the Diana Prince is the New Wonder Woman blog, the Rolled Spine podcast blog. Write to me at emailofdiabolu@yahoo.com, featuring 2 underscores, or just hit me up on Twitter at Commander Blanks or at Rolled Spine. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful week.